Lords of the Black Banner, a Mongolian epic. Fractured Empire, Book 2. Written by Starr Davies. Narrated by David Wiseman. Dedicated to Professor Kyle Fingerson for opening the door to this amazing discovery. Chapter 4. Uneasy Truths. Mongke Bulag. Fall, 1468. Mandukhai's stomach twisted in uneasy knots as she waited in the gathering tent. Scouts reported the Tumans would return from the south today, and her inevitable meeting with Unabulid increased her anxiety. Would he want to see her? Would he want to talk to her? In the weeks and months following the loss of the child, he had grown distant. Mandukhai often blamed herself for the loss. Mandukhai shifted slightly in her seat in the gathering tent, and glanced at Mandul as he waited patiently for the men to arrive. With each passing moment, her heart beat faster. In the first few weeks after losing the child, she had turned the events leading up to the loss over in her mind repeatedly. Knowing the child was a danger to others in power, she should have been more careful. Had she been more vigilant and less consumed by her grief and anger over Nergui's murder, she may have suspected the tea was poisoned before drinking it. She would have sniffed out the bitter scent of the herb before consuming it. It was not as if Mandukhai had been unfamiliar with mugwort. She had used it too, after Mandul forced himself on her to prevent conceiving his child. The guilt over missing something so significant as mugwort and pennywort in her tea had driven her away from Unabulid. Unable to face his disappointment, terrified that he would blame her and reject her. After losing her child, she didn't have the heart to lose him. Once she had overcome the hardest part of her guilt, Mandukhai had moved on to align what had happened with her vision of Genghis Khan. Genghis said she would give her heart once to passion and once to compassion, and she had no longer doubted who possessed her heart in passion. But had he meant she would give her heart to Mandul as well? He had certainly become surprisingly compassionate following the miscarriage. Yet, as time passed, the resentment toward Mandul for raping her and a jealous rage that first year of their marriage remained buried deep in her heart. She could never give her heart to him. Mandukhai's hands sweated in her lap. She glanced at the open door to the gathering tent. How much longer would they be waiting for Unabulid and Asama to arrive? For the next 2 years after the miscarriage, Unabulid had volunteered for missions in the Great Khan's name, and would disappear for months at a time without so much as a goodbye. When the mission south to agitate the Mongols along the Ming border had been proposed, Unabulid had been first to volunteer his services as Urlach. Mandukhai had wanted to beg him to stay. She had wanted to summon the courage to tell him she still loved him, that he still possessed her heart. Yet none of these words would surface. Their final conversation before he left had been as brief and distant as every other since the miscarriage. Mandukhai bit her lip and glanced at Togachi. He had suspected something had happened between Mandukhai and Unabulid. The extent of what Togachi knew she remained unclear on. Perhaps all of it. Perhaps almost none of it. Togachi had said nothing to her about the affair, though. Unabulid had given her no sign that Togachi knew either. Yeke sat in her usual place, hands folded in her lap and eyes fixed on some distant point. Since Bayan's departure, Yeke retreated further from everyone. She was but a shadow of the woman she once had been. At times, Mandukhai had been certain she witnessed madness in Yeke's vacant expressions. Upon hearing the Tumans would return, Yeke had come out of her shell. Yet the moment she learned Bayan was not among the returning men, she retreated once more. This odd behavior only increased Mandukhai's suspicion that something significant had happened between Yeke and Bayan. The crunch of boots against the hardening ground outside drew Mandukhai's attention toward the door before Unabulid or Sama entered. Bokeh, head of Mondul's guard, hardly spared a glance at Isama as he stepped through first. Isama's movements were fluid, like water over smooth rock. He even seemed to float toward the head of the room. Mandukhai only spared him a glance, immediately distracted by Unabulid as he ducked inside and marched forward. Where Isama moved like water, Unabulid marched like stone, stiff, formal, and confident that his very step could crush the earth beneath him. The two men bowed before Mondul, holding until the Khan waved for them to rise. Mandukhai struggled not to bite her lip as her stomach twisted in knots gazing at Unabulid. It took all of her willpower to avert her gaze to avoid it lingering too long.
"I hear you had some success along the border,"
Mondul said.
"Indeed, my Lord Khan,"
Isama said formally. His voice flowed like water as well, relaxed, cool, and confident.
"The Golden Prince has proven himself quite capable of gathering the confidence of those who lead the southern Tumans, though he has gone off our agreed dialogue."
Mondul grunted and rapped his fingertips on the arm of his throne. Mandukhai recognized this as a sign of his impatience. When she had heard he had summoned these men back, she inquired about the reason for cutting their mission short. Mondul had stated so many were unnecessary so far south, particularly with the Oirots stirring up trouble along his own borders. He needed his men back. Something about this explanation had not settled well with her. Mondul already had enough men in Monkey Bulag to hold against the Oirot. Why did he need another Tumen? How many thousands did he assume were necessary? 40? 50?
"Bolku can be impulsive, but I sent him because his charisma is enchanting,"
Mondul admitted. If any could succeed in this task, it is him. Mandukhai wanted to focus on the conversation, but she could feel Unabulid's eyes on her. It made her face burn. Her gaze flicked to Unabulid, who stared at her with such cold-faced intensity it made her heart quicken. The gaze only lasted for a moment before he turned his attention back to Mondul. But it had been more than enough to rattle her. What did that gaze mean? Had he returned with a burning desire to rekindle their extinguished flame? Or did he still resent her for what happened?
"My wives will arrange a feast to celebrate your safe return,"
Mondul said, pulling Mandukhai back to attention. He watched her expectantly.
"Of course, my Lord Khan,"
she said, inclining her head and making the Bacta headdress chime.
"Good."
Mondul rubbed his hands together.
"See to it then. I have a few more matters to discuss with these two. Togachi, see that we reward their men for their courage and loyalty."
Togachi bowed deeply before turning to march out. As he left, his gaze flicked from Mandukhai to Unabulid so quickly she was not sure if she had truly seen it. Yeke rose from her seat like a phantom and drifted toward the door. Mandukhai followed, her back straight, avoiding the penetrating eyes of Unabulid. But in doing so, she glimpsed Isama's suspicious gaze locked on Yeke, until she was out of sight. What was he thinking about? She dismissed it for now, unable to shake Unabulid's presence from her mind. There had been a time when Mandukhai could read Unabulid's eyes despite his stoic expression. Perhaps it was the rift between them, or perhaps the passage of time. But she no longer knew what he thought as he looked at her. What Mandukhai did know for certain was this. His presence still struck something deep within her that stirred her desire. Seeing Mandukhai in the gathering tent brought a rush of emotions back to the surface that Unabulid had expertly pushed behind a wall of duty. He did not have time for such emotions right now. While he had not given Togachi his word that nothing more would ever happen with Mandukhai, Togachi's warning after the miscarriage had been clear enough. As long as Mandul lived, Unabulid could not touch Mandukhai. Distance and his wall of duty were his best defenses. Mandul had never discovered the truth of the child, that it belonged to Unabulid and not himself. Desperate for justice, Unabulid had spent months attempting in vain to track down the source of the poison. The girl, Sarnia, who had been friends with the serving girl who poisoned Mandukhai, had disappeared nearly a year ago. She had been the only link to the man, Alton, who allegedly gave the serving girl the poisoned tea. Sarnia's disappearance had raised Unabulid's suspicion, but he had been unable to track her down. Alton remained as smoke in the wind, as he had always been. Unabulid blamed himself for the loss. He had known the child would be in danger from the moment Mandukhai had confessed she was pregnant. He had sworn to protect them. He had failed. He had failed knowing something could happen. He had failed at finding the killer, Alton. To make up for his failure, Unabulid threw himself into every task he could find to protect the Khan's people. It was the only way he could find to make amends within himself. Duty above all else. When Isama had proposed the plan to reignite the flame of former glory along the Min border, where their own Mongol people had been subjugated, Unabulid had eagerly heaved himself at the opportunity. As Mandukhai left the gathering tent today with Yeke to prepare the feast, her gaze met his. Uncertainty shined in her dark eyes. Uncertainty and something he could not identify.
She is even more radiant than I remember, he thought.
Mandul excused Boke and his guards, ordering them to stand outside and close the door behind them. They bowed before stepping out, leaving only Mandul, Isama, and Unabulid. Even the servants left them alone. Unabulid could not be certain how he felt about this turn of events. What could be so urgent Mandul would dismiss even the servants, guards, and Mandukhai? A fit of coughing overcame Mandul the moment the door closed. He hunched over, then spit a wad of phlegm into a cup. Unabulid tensed as he observed the Khan's state. Mandul drank from another cup, then sank back into his throne with a sigh. Beside Unabulid, Isama cocked his head and watched Mandul like a hungry bird watches a worm. Isama was far too curious for Unabulid's comfort. Still, he could not help sharing some of the curiosity. Mandul appeared more run down than he remembered. During the last year, Mandul had clearly lost some weight as well. Perhaps not enough for anyone in the capital to notice, but enough for his eyes to see after a year away. I have summoned you back to Manke Bulag for several reasons, Mandul began. First, and most pressing, is the activity among the Oirat. Isama, I know you have connections to the tribe. I need you to use those connections to find out what Paisahan Khan is up to. I fear the Oirat Khan is preparing to retaliate against either my heir or myself.
What sort of activity, my Lord Khan?
Isama asked. Scouts report their forces amassing along our western border, near the Kongai Mountain Pass. Mandul replied, dabbing his mouth with a cloth. I expect they will attack. You will diffuse the situation if possible, and if not, you will organize my Tumens to protect our people. Unabulid flinched, then shifted uneasily.
My Lord Khan, if he is to organize the Tumens, what do you need of me?
As Warlock, it was Unabulid's job to organize the Great Khan's northern Tumens, a task Unabulid excelled at. Mandul winced as he shifted in the seat. His age showed more since Unabulid had last seen him. Dark rings made the pools of his almost black eyes even deeper, and the corners of his mouth sagged ever so slightly. "Time, brother." Unabulid's brows wrinkled in confusion. Time? Organizing the field of battle, supply lines, commanding leaders of the Tumans, these were all skills Unabulid had sharpened over the years. He was adept at battle strategy and field marshalling. But how did one marshal time? Mondul waved a hand. "I will explain in a moment." He turned his attention back to Isama. Unabulid bristled. He could feel the muscles in his shoulders tighten as he clenched his fists. Being dismissed in such a way, when he could feel himself losing what little rank he had in the capital, crawled under his skin. "Should the Oirat attack, you will be my Orlok, Isama. Your counsel has been fair and wise, and your tactics since arriving in Monkey Bulag will serve our people well in the months to come." The air escaped Unabulid's lungs as if Mondul had punched him hard in the gut. His chest heaved with anger as he tempered his outrage. Mondul and Isama continued their conversation, but Unabulid's rage muffled his ears. First, Mondul had handed the line of succession over to Bayon, an inept and traitorous boy, after promising it to him years before. Now Mondul took away the command Unabulid had held since the beginning. Unabulid knew he should remain silent, but he could hold his tongue no longer. This was a grave insult. "My Lord Khan, have I done you some dishonor?" Unabulid interrupted sharply. "Have I not served you well since the beginning of your khanship? Have I not been a loyal servant to you and the Mongol Empire? Why do you give my command to another?" "Unabulid, I asked you for time," Mondul said with far more patience than Unabulid had a tolerance for at the moment. "Time?" Unabulid scoffed. "What does that even mean, Mondul? I cannot control the rising or setting of the sun, or the phases of the moon. No man can control time." Mondul's fingers rapped on the arm of the throne. "I did not ask you to control it. I ask you to give it." He heaved out a sigh that brought on another surge of coughing. Rage pumped through Unabulid's veins. All his life he had lived in Mondul's shadow, obeying his commands, only questioning when Mondul asked him to. He had lost his wife, 2 children, the khanship, his place as heir, and Mandukhai. Now he had lost the last piece of his life that gave him purpose. Mondul had no need for 2 Orloks. His army was not large enough. The oath he had sworn to obey Mondul tasted like bitter, spoiled milk in his mouth. Unabulid's muscles coiled so taut he thought they might snap. He wanted to draw his sword and strike Mondul down, but his honor would not allow it. Besides, if he killed Mondul here and now, he wouldn't make it out of the gathering tent alive. Maybe he could take Isama out before the new Orlok could strike him down, but Bokeh and the rest of Mondul's guard would descend on him. He could only take 1 or 2 men before they would kill him. Mondul spit into the cup again as he righted himself. "Brother, I have a task for you I could not trust in the hands of any other man. It is precisely because of your unwavering loyalty that I place this burden on your shoulders, and I understand it is a lot to ask." Unabulid quivered with rage. His fingernails bit into his palms as his fists tightened. "What duty could be greater than commanding your armies?" "When I named Bolku, you kneeled before him and swore the same oath you swore to me, to follow him with gears, horses, salt, and blood." Unabulid did not bother correcting Mondul. He had given Bayon no oath of any sort, nor would he ever. In exchange, I swear this oath to you now, Mondul continued. In return for your unyielding loyalty to myself and my nephew, should either of us fall and the line of Genghis finally be extinguished, you and your heirs will inherit the Khanship line. Tonight, as we feast, I will swear this in front of all of my people, so there is no question who will rule on our stead. Mondul bowed his head toward Unabulid. I ask you for time. Can you give me this? Unabulid's hands fell slack at his sides as the anger dissolved in a surge of shock. Could it be this easy? As long as Bayon had no heirs, Unabulid could at last take hold of the Khanship, and the line would remain with his sons by official decree. Unabulid would only have to dispose of Bayon before he had sons. After Mondul's eventual death, Unabulid could seize everything. Only one issue with this turn of events remained. Mondul still lived, and Unabulid did not know for how long. That gave Bayon plenty of time to produce sons. And at the rate the boy spread his seed, it was a miracle he did not already have a dozen children. Your will, my Lord Khan, Unabulid said. His voice was steady once more. Isama had stiffened through the exchange with his hands folded together before him inside the sleeves of his deal. Unabulid wondered if Isama had designs of his own that this news would unravel. Good. Mondul nodded briefly, then adopted a wistful expression, staring past both of them into some distant future. I have spoken with my shaman frequently. Kosoichi is doing all he can to delay the inevitable. But there is no avoiding it. I am dying. Unabulid's heart lifted, then plummeted. Dying? For years, Unabulid had prayed for this news, but now that Mondul spoke the words, it felt too soon. He hated him, and he loved him. Are you certain? Isama asked. Mondul nodded regrettably. This is why I have summoned you back. In the spring, I will call Bolku back and prepare him. Kosoichi believes he can hold off the inevitable for a year or two at most. Bolku will need you both during the transition. Unabulid knew he had to be careful how he chose his words from this moment on. He could say nothing that could be construed as an oath to Bayon. Yet he also needed Mondul to trust him to support Bayon. Mondul's face shifted to a sterner expression. Speak of this to no one else, not even my wives. I will tell them when I can no longer hide the truth from them. But until that day comes, there is no need to worry them unnecessarily when they can do nothing about it. I also do not want to alarm my people or alert our enemies. A line of succession has been established. I just need you two to carry out my final wishes. Unabulid still couldn't understand why Mondul would remove him from his post as Urlach, though. He could still serve the Great Khan and the Mongol Empire while acting as an heir. Mondul would not dare name Unabulid in the direct line of succession to prevent him from fighting in a battle and save him from death. Such an act would dishonor Unabulid. A Mongol who could not fight was not a Mongol worth following. Mondul, my men will wonder why I have been demoted, Unabulid said. What shall I tell them? You misunderstand me, brother, Mondul said. He breathed in a careful breath of fresh air before speaking again. I have just promoted you, and within the week you will take your men back to the Korchin to ensure their full backing when Bolku transitions into power. I am depending on you to maintain peace and gather more support from other lords in the east. You're sending me away? A jolt of shock rocked through Unabulid. Leaving would mean he could not see Mandukhai. They would not be able to formulate their own plan. Something else also occurred to him. Unabulid once more clenched his fists so tight the nails bit into his palms. When Mondul died, Bayan would then be married to Mandukhai. The very idea of that pretentious runt pressing himself into her filled Unabulid with rage and disgust. He could not allow it. Bayan would have to die. But how could he have the prince killed without breaking his oath, or turning the tribes against him?
"This is not an exile, Unabulid,"
Mondul said, a bit tersely.
"You will gather the Tumans under your command and support Bolku's right at Kurultai when the time comes. Can you handle this? You will be his heir, as will your children, assuming he has none. You will build your own army to command as Urlach in his name. I am giving you a great gift, brother. Take it."
"Of course, my Lord Khan," Unabulid said, bowing to Mondul. "You honor me." Perhaps this would work to Unabulid's benefit. "I can go east, gather support for myself to be the next great Khan, and see that Bayan dies in an accident, so none of those men support him instead." Unabulid's plan already began hatching in his mind. This trip would indeed be a gift. Then he would return to Mandukhai as the man she deserved, with his honor intact.
"You have earned it."
Mondul shifted and winced again, then reached for a cup of irog.
"Now, go prepare for the evening's festivities. We have much to celebrate, and much to commemorate."
Both men bowed deeply to their Khan and left. Unabulid watched as Sama float toward the Uyghur section of the capital. He could have sworn he saw a triumphant smirk on the new Orloc's face. 1 week, and he would take his men and return to the Korchin lands for the first time in 4 years. 1 week, and he would lose the chance to see Mandukhai daily. He would lose the opportunity to make amends. Once Mondul died, though, he would rid them both of Bayan. Then he could have it all. 1 week until he left Mankebulag. 1 year until everything was his at last. The knowledge strengthened his steps.
If you enjoyed this sample, click the links in the description to hear more. Do you want free audiobooks, ebooks, or autographed paperbacks? Join me on Patreon at patreon.com/szdavies_character-assassin. You'll gain access to my Discord server, behind-the-scenes updates, merch, and so much more.